I'm going to get to that, but often I try to kind of lay out how Muslims got in China and why this community is participating in this kind of vernacular type of intellectual tradition. What were the conditions that made them say, we're not going to use Arabic or Persian, which is the kind of dominant Islamic languages among Muslim communities elsewhere. Why did they start using Chinese as a way of expressing the religion? Knowing some of your backgrounds, some of this history might be familiar to you. So please forgive me. Please forgive the generalizations as well. But I usually start here just to kind of get people situated, so we're all kind of in the same place. So in thinking about how Muslims arrived in China, how they established communities there, it's important to note that even before the rise of Islam in the 7th century, there were Arabs and Persians traveling to China, both along kind of overland Silk routes and then maritime routes. So with the coming of Islam in the 7th century, we have Muslims, soon thereafter traveling primarily to these kind of stops along the Silk Route, heading to places like Chang'an, which is contemporary Xi'an, which was the capital of the Tang Dynasty at this time. We also have large port cities on the southeastern coast, places like Guangzhou and Quanzhou, that now we have archaeological evidence of things like tombstones with verses of the Quran written on them. We have Al-Ashab Mosque, or the Companions Mosque, which you can still go to. It's basically, for those of you who've seen mosques in China, they basically look like any other Chinese building, Chinese temple, Buddhist temple, Daoist temple. So this mosque, this very early mosque, does not have that kind of localized architecture. It's very Middle Eastern in its depiction. So we have some evidence of kind of early inhabitants, Muslim inhabitants. But really, it's for the first few centuries, Muslims are largely coming as merchants. They're largely temporary residents in a sense. They're largely understood and both from within the community and then from the larger Chinese community as seen as outsiders, as foreigners, right, as kind of temporary participants in society. Right, and again, these numbers are small, right? So we don't really have the establishment of Islam during this early period. Population is under the Mongols, and specifically the Yuan dynasty. Under the Mongol administration in the Yuan, they basically, right, so these people are placed all throughout China, right? They're set up as administrators, as scientists, astronomers, geographers, artisans, these kind of things. And so it's with the Mongols that we have primarily male Muslims, right, from Central Asian coming. They start to intermarry with culturally Chinese people during this period, right, and we start to have some of the roots of indigenous Muslim community. Again, the generalizations, so forgive the generalizations, but this should kind of give you a picture. Or one thing to note, right? The other thing that's important about the Mongols is that for these communities of Muslims, the expansive nature of the Mongol Empire in general, travel, connections with home communities was possible, right? So this would be important, at least for my folks, in the sense that religious education, right, was still available, so people could go to their home communities, right, go to important places of Islamic education, right, to access ideas about Islam, which is a Han-ruled dynasty, right? We kind of have a turning of the social privileges that Muslims had, in the sense that there's a reordering under the Mongols, right? Where kind of had a social status below the Han as kind of the highest social group, right, in terms of a social hierarchy. I don't want to overstate this, of course, right? But there is a kind of reordering of the social order. Communities that are now rooted here. There's a increase in what we might think of as assimilation or acculturation of these Muslim communities, in the sense that there are policies that require them to wear, quote unquote Chinese dress, use Chinese language, intermarry with Chinese people, right? And Han people is what I mean by Chinese here. Right, and so there is this kind of assimilation after several generations of these families that can connect their roots to some foreign homeland, right? Usually Central Asia, but often in other instances Arab or Persian ancestors as well. The other thing that happens in the Ming that's important for the community that I look at is that while the Ming Dynasty wasn't a internally focused empire in and of itself, right? So there's lots of state-sponsored expeditions, for example, and Muslims actually played a significant role in many of these. There's a very famous sailor named Zheng He that is often kind of touted as this grand explorer. There was outward connections, but for what we might think of as the everyday folk, the kind of porousness that was available in terms of travel and connections to foreign lands under the Yuan is really diminished, right? So what that meant kind of in terms of Islamic learning, right, which is what I'm interested in, is that many of these communities lost the ability to return to centers of learning, right? They largely lost the ability to use at a higher level many other languages, specifically Arabic and Persian, which were the key languages of Islamic learning in this region, right? From Persia east. Persian is equally as important as Arabic, if not more important very often. So this, of course, affected the levels of Islamic education that was happening in China. And this is where the kind of story that I'm looking at begins. And it begins in Shanxi in northwest China. And one thing to note about the communities here is that in this region, Muslim communities would be very often in Muslim majority contexts, in the sense that there would be large communities of Muslims, right? So social norms, social privileges would be given to Muslims, right, as being kind of the most populous in many communities. This will be opposed to when we get later where Muslims are minorities, right? The social circumstances change. But here, right, being Muslim was part of everyday life, right? In terms of learning, during this time, though, because of being cut off from this, often we're told that if you wanted any kind of higher learning, right, in terms of learning even the Quran, learning the various interpretive traditions, right, around legal thinking or philosophical or theological thinking, these were very limited, and they were often based on what religious professionals were in the region. So one of the important folks that were introduced through this narrative is this figure Hu Dongzhou, who tells us that he would go to his local religious professional, right, an imam, and he would study with the imam, and he basically ultimately felt dissatisfied in the level of knowledge he was able to explore, right? He wanted more, right? And his local religious professional was only able to, provide so much. It was kind of an idiosyncratic type of education in the sense that it was based on the positionality of that religious professional in terms of what he knew, what texts he had, right? This was another really key thing that happened during the Ming, right? Because people are cut off, access to texts became very limited. So because of this dissatisfaction, we're told that Hu traveled abroad. He went to Arabia and he studied there. And when he returns with a number of texts, right? A number of texts that he uses to then formulate and replicate a kind of what's usually called a madrasa, a fixed curriculum of Islamic education. And this is what ends up being called jingtang jiaoyu, or scripture hall education. And when Hu returned, right, the key thing that he had was these texts, right? He had a number of texts, both Arabic and Persian, right, that were authoritative, right? Authoritative in the broader Muslim community, and he returns and makes these available to the Sino-Muslims in his community, right? So he creates this educational setting where there's a fixed curriculum, right, of these texts, and I should say that of course not everyone is engaging, right, going through and learning Persian and Arabic, and right. So this curriculum, it's for kind of higher level of learning, right, as opposed to every day. Most Muslims would. Some might know a little bit of Arabic for speaking, right? But in this educational setting, right, people like who wanted a more advanced education in Islam, right? This provided that for him. So he has this fixed curriculum. He also then starts to provide financial support for students. And this becomes really, really important as well, because unlike his situation where he was limited to his own imam, right, his own religious professional, right? Now people could come from various parts of China, right, study in the scripture hall, and then what happened afterward is then after they went through this curriculum, right, they often returned to wherever they came from, and then they would replicate this system, right? They would have their own copies of these texts, and then they could start this own curriculum in their own region, right? The other thing that is important here, right, is he includes Chinese language instruction, which of course would be important in a Chinese context, right, which wouldn't be replicated in other madrasa-style education. So some students from this region, right, after they return, it's really in Nanjing that a new phase in the scripture hall education starts to take form. And the thing to note here is that in a place like Nanjing compared to a place like Shanxi, right, Nanjing is a cosmopolitan city. Muslims in this area would be a minority in terms of the numbers of the populations, and Muslims would be very much acculturated in what we might think of as Chinese culture, right? So they're going through typical Chinese style education. They're often becoming administrators, right? They're taking civil service exams, right? So they're very much part of what we might think of as Chinese society. At the same time, right, they many of them, right, being highly educated, right, being part of this kind of literati class, they wanted to know more about Islam, right? As you could imagine, they often weren't familiar with Arabic or Persian. So what starts to happen is some of the successful students in the scripture hall education start to make Chinese language Islamic texts aimed at this audience, right? Aimed at this kind of specific and I mean it's a limited audience, right? Highly educated, highly familiar with Chinese discourses, right, and philosophical systems. So this what's usually referred to as the Han Kitab, right? Han, of course, trying to connote this idea of Chineseness. Kitab is the word for book in Arabic, right? So it's this combination. And so in the mid-17th century, we start to have authors producing Chinese language texts that are talking about Islamic theology, Islamic mysticism, Islamic philosophy. And they utilize this very specific Chinese discourse of Neo-Confucian vocabulary, Buddhist, Daoist vocabulary that would be widely known by this kind of elite Muslim cosmopolitan of Nanjing and places like this, right? So in thinking about the kind of rendering of Islam through a Chinese framework, things like prophets become sages, right? Saints become worthies, scriptures become classics. And so when we're talking about Muhammad, right, and Islam basically as a teaching, it's often referred to or framed in the sense of the Tao of the most sagely, or the Tao of the utmost sage. Right? So this is kind of the flavor of these texts, right? The kind of way that they're putting this all together. Again, I want to note that this is one specific, limited way of interpreting Islam in China during this kind of pre-modern period. Right? It's not the only way of doing this. Right? Many people were not interested in these texts. Right? They didn't think they were valuable. There were other traditions, specifically in northwest China, we were talking about earlier, that followed a more kind of embodied and charismatic type of practice of Islam, usually related to what are called Sufi brotherhoods, that instead of thinking about more, philosophical notions of what is the meaning of God's oneness, right? This is kind of the primary principle of Islam, right? Is that God is one. This notion is called tawheed. Instead of reflecting on these kind of more theological questions, right, they're more interested in kind of a participatory type practice or ritual practice. So they might do things like recite the names of God, right, which is called something called dhikr. Right, they have they try to cultivate a close relationship through a religious teacher that they see as being close to God. Right, so this again, I just want to point out that I don't want to paint this as this is Islam in China, right, in total. Right, this is one way of doing this among this very specific audience. Who in many of these texts that begin to develop reference themselves by this term Huiru, right, or a kind of Confucian Muslim, or a Muslim literati, or something like this. Right? So this is kind of even how they articulate their own identity. So in my work, I look at three of these figures that for me kind of mark key transitions in this intellectual tradition of this Han Kitab, right? So the first is Wang Dayu. Wang Dayu is important because he was the first author of these Chinese language Islamic texts. There's a few others that are referenced before this, but none of them exist in, and they might have been translations of Arabic or Persian texts. It's not really quite clear if they were actually referencing Chinese language texts that were produced in China, or if they were just translations of existing Persian and Arabic texts. So Wang Dayu is the first kind of key author in this tradition. Luzher becomes kind of the pinnacle in many ways, partly because of the sophistication in which he employs primarily Neo-Confucian vocabulary to express Islam, but also in his output. He has a tremendous output in terms of textual production. So for many, he is like the key to understanding the Han Kitab. And then what really brought me to this project was this figure, Ma Dushan, who's writing in a very different social context, intellectual context as well. Both Wang Dayu and Lu Zhi were based in Nanjing, we were talking about before. Ma Dexin is actually based in southwest China, in Yunnan, which has a different social dynamic, right? So here also, there are many communities that are Muslim majority communities. There's a kind of a richer or more robust tradition of Islamic education here. But I argue, the reason why I bring him in here is because he replicates the kind of strategies and discourses that these earlier Han Kitab authors use. So I think he sees himself, right, as part of this tradition, even though he's doing some radically different things. And so this is actually, so I started with him because he was unique in many ways. So one of the things he did that was unique within this tradition was he was the first Sino-Muslim to record a pilgrimage diary, right? So there were several significant Sino-Muslims that went on pilgrimage, right? Went to Mecca, to the Arabian Peninsula, and they're important, right? So there's several that went that were these in these Sufi brotherhoods that become prominent leaders. But he's the first to record his pilgrimage. He spent about 8 years traveling. So he went through past India, right, through Yemen, spent time in Arabia, went to North Africa and places like Egypt, spent time in the Ottoman Turkey, and then returned through Southeast Asia, spent a couple years in Southeast Asia before returning. And it's at that time he then begins his writing process. And so this seems significant that he leaves this record, right, for other Sino-Muslims to have a specific guideline for going on Hajj themselves, right? So he's also a key advocate of going on pilgrimage. Whereas the other two, neither one of them, Wang Dayu actually stayed in Nanjing his whole life up until the very end. He moved to Beijing right at the end of his life. Lu Zhi did travel primarily to other centers of Islamic learning in China, though. And this was often to have other teachers within the scripture hall education read his work, and often he would get prefaces from these other figures. But he also never left China. The other thing that was significant of Ma Dexin is he writes in Arabic for his Sino-Muslim students, right? So this is significant in and of itself, but also it's a transition from this Persianate tradition that was often privileged by many of the earlier authors. So I guess I'm jumping around here a little bit, but so Lu Zhi, for example, translated Persian Islamic text into Chinese. There was other figures that translated often philosophical Sufi texts, right? So like these kind of mystical type texts that were important in the Persian tradition. So these were very prominent among these Han Kitab authors. So shifting to a kind of more Arabic discourse, right, was reflective of kind of global changes that are happening during the 19th century among Muslims worldwide, where there's kind of a reform happening. So Ma Dexin is, I argue, is trying to prepare his students to have knowledge of not only this kind of localized or vernacular type of Islamic discourse, but also this kind of global Arabic modern discourse about Islam. And then the last thing he did that was really significant was he was the first Sino-Muslim to attempt to translate the whole Quran into Chinese. So prior to this, figures like Wang Dayu, Lu Zhi, and other earlier Han Kitab authors, they would translate passages of the Quran in their broader texts. You know, often they would take a passage and then try to explain it, right, in a kind of almost commentary. At other times, they would be making an argument about something and then use Quranic passages to kind of justify or legitimate their interpretation of certain ideas. But he was the first to kind of systematically try to translate the Quran. And again, I argue, I think this is part of his the social position in which he's in, right? So I argue that at this time, right, at least for him, he believes that Sino-Muslims don't only need to have this kind of limited theological knowledge, but they have to have comprehensive knowledge of the Quran as a kind of theological foundation, right? So in many communities in China as well, there's lots of people who can read and recite the Quran, right, as kind of almost a ritual, liturgical practice, but not necessarily know what they're saying, right? So like, I could teach you all Arabic, or perhaps you could teach us all Arabic, right? In a matter of days, right? You'd be able to read it, but of course you wouldn't know what it's saying, right? So that was a practice that was happening. But for Ma Dushin at this time, by producing this translation, right? He's marking this shift that this needs to be kind of a theological foundation for understanding modern Islamic discourses. So unfortunately, for Ma Dushin, he was living at a time where in southwest China there was a rebellion, right, against the Qing Manchu government, and there was the establishment of a Islamic state, right? So he was what we might think of as kind of the head cleric of this state. It was led by a figure named Du Wenxiu, and it lasted for about 10 years, right? And then ultimately, the Qing, after numerous battles, was able to overtake this state. And so in 1874, along with Du Wenxiu and other leaders in this movement, Ma Dushin was killed. So he didn't complete this translation. So we only have the first 4 chapters. But right, it's something to begin with. All right. So just to kind of give you a little bit of flavor of what these figures are talking about in their text, to try to mark some of these transitions. Wang Dayu's major text is this true explanation of the Orthodox teaching. This is a significant sized text. It's about 40 chapters broken up into 2 halves. So the first 20 chapters are more theological in nature. So they're a few pages each about the nature of faith, the nature of oneness, ideas about having God consciousness or God fearingness, something like this. The second 20 are more practical in nature. So they're dealing with things like what is the ideal relationship between a husband and wife, right? How do we establish social roles in the family? These kind of things. And while he's using this kind of Neo-Confucian vocabulary, from the kind of tone of this text, and then kind of determined by the subjects, it seems that he's writing for a kind of novice audience, in the sense that while it's in this kind of literary Chinese, right, it's still getting into things at not at an advanced level, right? So it seems like, as the first author, this makes sense, right? That these kind of cosmopolitan readers that would be his audience, right, would be familiar with these discourses, but perhaps unfamiliar with a kind of detailed explanation of even the key principles about Islam, right? So they might know that, right, there's one God, but they might not know kind of the theological background, well, why that oneness is important, or why that oneness is unique, or something like this. So this is kind of what his works are about. The other, for most of you, will be very clear, right? He has this other small text, the Qing Dashue. The Dashue, of course, for those of you who don't know, is the name of one of the key kind of early Confucian texts, right? That outlines kind of ideas about kind of ethical social behavior, these kind of things, right? So. And he uses this term, Qingjian, which those of you who've been to China are familiar with, of course, right? Which basically comes to mean, or kind of connote ideas about Islam, right? So instead of the great learning, he has the Islamic great learning, right? And this is a kind of short text that he has. Lu Zhi, he, again, part of the reason why he's seen as this kind of pinnacle within this tradition, one is just the output. He has a tremendous output in terms of textual production. As I mentioned, right, he does things like translate Persian Islamic text. So he translated a very famous text called the Lawa'i by a figure named Abdurrahman Jami, who was a poet and mystic who was based in Herat, who kind of is one of the key figures in this Persianate Islamic tradition. Right? So Lu Zhi translated this text into Chinese. He also has a really, really fascinating text called the Explanation of the Islamic Alphabet, which it's an awesome text to look at, really, because basically it says, right, here we have the letter Aleph, right, which is like A, I guess. We'll call it A, right? Right, the letter A in the Arabic alphabet. And then it says, right, this is why we have this letter, and this is why it's positioned like this. It's a straight line up and down. Right? Talk about the kind of theological significance of these letters, and then he'll say, right, and then we have the Ba, right, which is the B, right, and the B is this, and he goes through all the kind of meanings behind these Arabic letters, and there's this one part that's really interesting, and this is a part of there's a whole Islamic tradition of doing this kind of letterism, right? The importance of these letters, that there's more kind of there's something behind the letters as opposed to just being, you know, random lines, and but he takes the letters for the word Muhammad, right, the prophet in Islam, and right, as many of you know, right, Chinese at this time is written up and down, right? Arabic is written right to left. So when he's writing Arabic, he's writing up and down, right? He's writing, and he takes the letters for Muhammad, and he says, right, after we have all this big explanation of these individual letters, when we put all these letters together, right, as you can see, it embodies the human being. And perhaps you're the only one who could picture this in your head, and I'd probably screw it up if I tried to write it down, but basically the M for Muhammad is like a circle, right? And then the other letters in the middle kind of go out like almost like arms. And then he kind of formulates it in a way up and down that the shape of the word Muhammad looks like a person, right? And this is part of you know, broader traditions where the Prophet Muhammad is often called the perfect human being, right? So he has texts like this, right? And so he has a whole assortment of different types of texts. His real kind of major contribution are these three texts here, which are often referred to as this Tianfang trilogy. And Tianfang also similar, right? You may notice that Qingzhen, before I translated Islam, now I'm doing Tianfang. Tianfang literally means, something like a heavenly square, heavenly cube. So people associate this with the Kaaba in Mecca, right? Which is this this square building in Mecca that you've probably all seen, right? It's covered in a black cloak. So this phrase Tianfang usually gets you know, connotes ideas about Islam as well, right? So he has this metaphysics of Islam, the rituals of Islam, and then the veritable record of the most sagely of Islam. And this, right, these three texts, right, do these three things, right? One is talking about more kind of theological or ontological ideas about the world. The second is related to ideas about what are the behaviors, the correct practices we're supposed to be doing. And then the last is a biography of Muhammad, right, of the Prophet Muhammad. And this, for those of you that are familiar with the Islamic tradition, will see that this reflects a very famous hadith. It's called the Hadith of Gabriel. And in the Hadith of Gabriel, which is probably one of the most famous hadith, and hadith in general are traditions that tell us what the Prophet Muhammad did or what the Prophet Muhammad said. Right? This formulates really the larger part of the kind of textual resources for Muslims in general, right? So the Quran is a very slim text when it actually comes down to it, but the Hadith, which are all these reports about what Muhammad did and said, right, really formulate much of the tradition of what we think of when we think of Islam. So there's this very famous Hadith, the Hadith of Gabriel, where the angel Gabriel, who's the intermediary between God and Muhammad, comes to Muhammad and his companions, right, and basically asks them, what is your religion? What is your religion all about? And he outlines it, that it's faith or belief, that it's practice, and then it's doing things in the most kind of intentional and utmost way, right? That all your actions are pointed towards God, right? So there's these three dimensions in this hadith that get outlined as this is what being a Muslim is, right? It's having faith, it's having these specific practices, and then it's doing these things in this real intentional way. And the word in Arabic that often is used is this word taqwa, that's sometimes rendered God-fearing, but I think God-consciousness is probably a better English. I don't know, do you have a...
It shares the same.
Yeah.
Here, but it's mostly the consciousness.
Yeah.
Aware of God.
Yeah, exactly. So it's this idea of like embodying these intentions, right? Pointing yourself towards God in everything you do. And for Muslims, the way you do that is by following the example of the Prophet, right? So by constructing these three texts, right? What are the things we are to believe in, right? The metaphysics of Islam. What are the right or the correct ways of doing things, right? This idea of kind of orthopraxy. And then providing a model through the Prophet Muhammad, right, becomes this kind of, this perfect example, this perfect model. So, Luger really, he was very successful in not only kind of employing this kind of rich combination of these kind of weighted Neo-Confucian terms to express all this, but he has this very systematic and comprehensive understanding of Islam that he can present in this very kind of complete way. And then the last figure, Ma Dushin, right? He also has this very, very comprehensive or expansive output. Many of his texts are theological in nature. So these first two are basically theological texts that are dealing with different subject matters. Some of them are things like what are heretical practices that we shouldn't do, right? And here he often refers to these Sufi brotherhoods, the things that these Sufi brotherhoods in the Northwest are doing, things like this dhikr, this remembrance practice. And then he has, right, of course, this pilgrimage text. He has his translation, his incomplete translation. And then he has numerous texts in Arabic as well. So things that are dealing with things like Arabic grammar, astronomy, geography. So he really covers this comprehensive or expansive spectrum of subjects. And for me, right, the combination of kind of providing this literal map of how to participate in a global Muslim community by going abroad, by going on the pilgrimage, right, by trying to provide this comprehensive knowledge of the Quran, and then also providing Sino-Muslims with the ability to be kind of cognizant and conversant within Arabic Islamic discourses, I think marks Ma'adushin as this kind of key transition where Sino-Muslims are beginning to see themselves as part of a global Muslim community as opposed to this kind of limited or kind of localized Muslim community. So I think I don't want to. I have some stuff that usually I read at this point, but I don't want to bore you guys. So perhaps we could. I mean, there's probably lots of directions that we could go with this. I mean, and often people always ask, well, what's going on now with Muslims in China? So we can talk about that as well. So yeah. So thanks.
Okay, so my question is, what would be like your strategy for identifying a frame or a way of writing strategically that is neo-Confucian
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that could potentially have some similarities to what I.
Sure. Yeah. No. This is a great question, and this usually gets teased out in some of these examples that I try to go through. But so for the people within this community, right? And again, this is a specific, kind of boxed off community that are going to have certain knowledge, right? That other communities are not going to have, right? Your everyday Muslim on the street is not going to be cognizant of Neo-Confucian discourse or these kind of things. But for most of these people in this educational system, right, they're trained in traditional Chinese learning, which is a set of various texts, right, that are usually mastered, memorized, right. There's often also common literary works that are part of a kind of literati milieu, right, so to speak. So what happens in many of these texts is they'll employ terminology or specific technical vocabulary that would have a meaning in a philosophical Daoist context or in a Neo-Confucian context. And then they'll use that to articulate very often technical Arabic or Persian terminology. So one example I use, I take a look at, kind of zoom into Ma Zexin's translation of the Quran, because there it's very easy to see, oh, well, he's using this term for that term. What exactly is going on there? And so there's this term in Arabic, deen. And deen is often rendered religion in English, which, as someone in religious studies, that becomes problematic because the idea of religion it's not a native category in most languages, right? Sanskrit, Chinese, right? It's not a way of conceptualizing the world, but different conversation. But so it's usually rendered religion, right? This idea of deen. So in almost all cases, right, this term deen shows up, half a dozen or so times in the 4 chapters he almost always translates it as Tao, right? The term Tao, which usually means path or way or something like this, right? And this, of course, has a long history of articulation and reinterpretation and contestation within various schools of Chinese thought, right? So, but it's not a one-to-one rendering, right? So in a more limited sense, deen can mean something like a law or an ordinance or a set of guidelines. And if we were going to think of a Chinese correlate, we might think of something like the word for law, like fa, something like this. He doesn't do that. Or to go the other way, if we're going to think of Tao, which is usually a path or way, we might think in an Arabic context that's the literal translation of the word Sharia, which is usually understood, or it's usually rendered Islamic law in English, right? Which it means more kind of ethical, moral norms or these kind of things, but it's often determined through legal discourses. But so the question then is, well, why is he doing this, right? What is it about the word Tao for him that kind of works better in the context of his audience as opposed to some other context? So this is the kind of stuff I try to figure out in the text that I'm looking at, is like, what are the what is the well-known vocabulary, right? Of course, there's things that are not going to have this kind of rich meaning like the word Tao, but when we come across these terms or phrases, so he, in some cases when he's talking about God, he'll use this phrase, the most revered and respected, right? Which is it's a phrase that's often used to talk about the Buddha, right? So again, what's going on here, and when his audience or readers would hear this, what would it mean in their context, right? That are familiar with that Chinese discourse and then perhaps not with the Arabic or Persian originals. I don't know if that's what you're asking, but
If I understand you correctly, it's like your coding scheme is probably what I would call it.
sure, I wouldn't, but
It's just like
yeah, right. No, that's a good way to put it.
my territory a little bit.
Yeah.
plausible alternatives.
Yeah.
They're signaling a Daoist or a Buddhist or a Neo-Confucian interpretation by using certain
Yeah.
legitimate or plausible terms.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So the other part of this then, of course, is these texts can mean a multitude of things depending on the subjectivity of the reader, right? So somebody who is highly versed in the Confucian tradition, but not in the Islamic tradition, I mean, they might not even understand the kind of Islamic background to this, right? Or vice versa, right? If somebody is not familiar with the kind of Confucian background, they might not really see how those terms line up. And I mean, just maybe as an example to kind of think about this in a little bit further, one question I get a lot about this stuff is like, how was this received more broadly, like outside of this very limited Muslim cosmopolitan type audience? And for the most part, people ignored it. Nobody really cared. You know, for those of you who know about China, right? Documenting, collecting, cataloging text was very, very important, right? There was only one of Lu Zhi's texts that was actually included in this kind of compendium of all Chinese texts under the Qing, right? All the others, right? Numerous others were all just ignored. And the comment that was made about it was something along the lines of this author is able to master our language, right, or our discourse to talk about this kind of subordinate tradition, right, something like this. Yeah, and another thing kind of related to this is some people who work on this stuff say that one of the goals of these texts is to demonstrate that that Muslims were Chinese, right? That instead of kind of, so I don't agree with that. I think that these texts were internally focused within, you know, built within the scripture hall system for the scripture hall system. Others try to say, right, that they're trying to demonstrate their Chineseness by mastering this kind of way of speaking, even though they're talking about, you know, a totally different tradition with ideas about the end of times and afterlife and all these ideas that don't really show up in these kind of Chinese discourses. So so they can mean a whole multitude of things. But yeah, I guess it's kind of a way of coding. I always thought about it in ways of registers, right? Different people are going to have different registers in terms of their understanding or how these things are expressed. But
yeah, talking about this, when they begin to use Qing, what's the corresponding original word for it?
well, so I mean that usually is referencing halal, the idea of halal, which basically means permissible. So, but in a practical sense, right, halal means this is right, prepared in a way that makes it acceptable. So I guess that's kind of why Qingjian makes sense, in the sense that this is prepared in a, you know, clean manner. But yeah.
Here it's not used in terms of food in many ways. It's
Well,
used like kind of just to reflect Islam, right?
yeah, so because halal more broadly does mean like it is permissible, right? So things beyond food are going to be permissible, right? So actions, behaviors, all sorts of things. It's one way of kind of classifying the world, right, in a way of understanding. So, yeah.
This idea of, I mean, it's called cultural translation.
Yeah, yeah.
Because you mentioned Mad, if I pronounce his name.
Madushin.
That he wrote in Arabic.
Yeah.
So does he in Arabic as well translate this Chinese concept? Like I wonder, like if somebody
Yeah, that's a great question.
who doesn't know Chinese and read this in Arabic, would he be like learning something new? Like he would be probably amazed, like this is a new take on the religion, like this
Yeah.
concept of Confucianism, you know.
Right.
Or
No, not really. Yeah, so in the Arabic text, it's interesting because he really replicates all the kind of norms we would find in kind of like 18th, 19th century Arabic language texts, like if we went to South Asia or we went to other places. So there's it begins with the Bismillah, and then there's this long litany of names of God, and so he replicates much of this kind of the norms of these texts. In terms of, I mean, he's coming from a specific kind of theological school, I guess we could say, right? One that's certainly influenced by this kind of philosophical Sufi tradition. So people like Jami, people like, in the school of Ibn Arabi, these kind of things were certainly influential in that. So in that sense, right, if people that are perhaps rejecting those kind of Sufi types of texts, they would say perhaps this is this isn't accurate, this isn't true. They might blame it on, right, this is kind of because it's a Chinese derivative, right? That somehow the Chineseness has screwed it up. But really, I mean, if people didn't, I mean, you would know from his name, Yusuf As-Sindi, right? This is marking him as Chinese. But if without that title, if you just read the Arabic text, you probably wouldn't know, oh, this is some Chinese Muslim that's writing this. Yeah.
He's the only one who used that name, or the others also adopted
So the other.
Arabic names?
Well, so the figures that I look at, right? So basically, this is all based on my book, right? So I have a book called Interpreting Islam in China, which is I'm looking at these three figures. So the other two figures never adopt Arabic names, and I have a chapter that looks at how do these figures use Arabic. And so, for example, Wang Daiyu largely ignores it in his text, right? So the only real instances that he uses Arabic in any kind of way is there's a couple of words that he transliterates through Chinese characters. So like he talks about the kursi, right, the footstool of God. And for that he uses two characters, Chinese characters, to transliterate that. That practice becomes much more common by the time Lu Jur is writing. So, and especially in his Rituals of Islam book, he transliterates lots of Arabic terms. He also has this book I mentioned, right, that talks about the kind of theological meaning behind Arabic letters, right? So by the time Lu Jur is writing, Arabic is much more, or at least I'm arguing, much more present in the minds of Sino-Muslims within this educational system, right? So perhaps they're not ready to be reading Arabic texts, or writing Arabic texts themselves, but in terms of the curriculum, right, it's becoming more and more present. And then by the time we get to Madushin, right, that he's writing Arabic texts for his Sino-Muslim students, I would argue because he's under the impression that they will partake in this kind of larger global discourse, right, by going abroad and these kind of things.
Because I look at the time here in which you live, and you went to pilgrimage, and I know around that time there was Wahhabism, in Arabia.
Yeah.
So it was like this course that was they call it like superstitions, like
Sure. Yeah. Of course.
Practices of the Sufis.
Right. Yeah. Rejected.
They reject it. So a lot of the people who went on pilgrimage from different parts of the world,
Yeah.
when they came back with that attitude. They
Right.
negative perception of. They came like reformers.
Right.
They want to reform the religion because these people have brought these heresies.
Yeah.
So I was looking at that. To what extent was he himself? He came under that.
Yeah, this is a great question as well, which without a lot of background in Islam is hard to perhaps understand, but perhaps you'll give me a minute here to try to tease it out. But so another reason why I think Madushin is really, really interesting in this time period among like global Islam is, forgive me, your name was Ahmed. As Ahmed said here, right, what's happening more broadly is there's lots of people that are saying, these things that are often part of what we might think of as quote-unquote culture, right? So things like celebrating the Prophet's birthday, having these close relationships with religious leaders, going to the tombs of deceased religious professionals to serve as intercessors or these kind of things. A lot of people are saying, right, this is all made up, right? We need to get rid of all this stuff. And we need to go back to the sources, right? We need to go back to the Quran, we need to go back to the Hadith. And so there is this kind of milieu. It really takes off a little bit later, I think, more like the early 20th century with like Rashid Rida and these folks. But so there are these kind of reform movements that are happening. And so Madushin, he doesn't write until after he returns from pilgrimage. And the pilgrimage journey text is rather dry. So he doesn't really talk about like, oh, I experienced this and blah, blah, blah. It's more like I spent 3 days here and then traveled by camel and did this, and then I went to this, place or that place. But in other texts, he talks about how his understanding of Islam was reformed. Right? He talks about this. And but unlike some of these reformers that reject what we might think of as like their vernacular tradition, he's very much bridging the two, right? So not only is he replicating the things that these other earlier Han Kitab authors are doing, another thing that he was doing in addition to writing his own stuff was he was basically editing and then republishing abridged versions of their works. So he takes Wang Dayu's work, he takes Lu Zhi's work, edits it, republishes it in his context for his own audience. And so he's doing both, right? He's kind of both saying, you need to be modern, you need to know Arabic, you need to know the Quran, you need to go and join your Muslim brothers abroad. But he's also saying, and we need to be part of this, right? This vernacular tradition, right? We need to replicate this. This is something, he didn't want to reject it, right?
There's, an old talk about his religious tradition, like in medieval Islam, what is called the ijaza, like.
Right. No. So.
You would say, I have.
Right. Of course.
Spent 2 years with this scholar.
Yeah.
For me, like sort of like a diploma or something.
I know. It's so this is something that most schools or communities of Chinese Islam do not seem to participate in very much. So he doesn't say like I studied with so and so or I got permission to teach this text or these kind of things. He doesn't mention any of that kind of stuff, which is rather frustrating. Right? It would be great to have that information.
That was the traditional, conventional.
Yeah, exactly. So that actually we were talking about that at Notre Dame. Is like why wouldn't that be important within a Chinese context? And perhaps this kind of the genealogy abroad is less important than the genealogy within the scripture hall education.
This probably supports also your view, like this was more of an internal,
Yeah.
Like he was more concerned about keeping the sort of like the integrity of the community,
Right.
communicating with the Muslims in his city or town or area, rather than proving
Yeah.
his status in relationship of chain of genealogical, like,
Right. Yeah.
order. I mean, because that would be like if he was trying to become global.
Right.
Because there was this pan-Islamism, like there was like a lot in Southeast Asia,
Sure.
in India at the time, which would be like after Afghani and Afghan
Right.
stuff. But it seems like he was more focused on the local.
Yeah, certainly. And I know we're like at time, so I don't want to go on too much longer. But the one other just quick thing, kind of related to your question. So Ma Dexin has two. He has one direct student, and then another person who's kind of takes over his position. So he wasn't his direct student, but he's kind of influenced by him. And so his direct student was this figure Ma Anli, who his main text is it's called the Tianfang Shijing. So the Islamic book of poetry is what we would translate it. And what it is, it's a translation of the Qasida al-Burda, which is this famous poem that talks about the Prophet Muhammad. And this poem is like you go to any community of Muslims anywhere and like someone will know this poem by heart. It's like the most famous poem, right? So in that way, he's I think he's embodying Ma Dexin's kind of mission in the sense that he's taking this very global Muslim thing and making it localized. And then this other figure, Ma Lianyuan, basically wrote almost entirely in Arabic, all his for the Sino-Muslim students. But one of his major texts was a translation of so in the Metaphysics of Islam of Lu Zhi, he writes what he calls the root classic, which is basically a summary, and it goes through and basically summarizes what the key teachings of this are. Right, so it's a shorter text. This guy, Ma, translates the root classic back into Arabic and then publishes it in South Asia. Right? So it doesn't, of course, there's not like tons of copies and these kind of things. But for me, right, it's interesting that, you were asking, like, could somebody tell? In this sense, right, he found that even though perhaps Sino-Muslims were seen as this kind of other kind of derivative type of tradition, right? For him, even though he was writing all in Arabic, he said this part of is significant, right? This is valuable for other Muslims outside of this community. So, yeah, I mean, obviously, I could talk about this stuff for a long time. So, but I think these two examples at the end, and those are kind of some of the stuff I want to look at in the future is exciting, right? This kind of splitting. So.
I have similar questions about the language.
Yeah.
Influenced by the scriptural education, a lot of Muslims use the scriptural language.
Yeah.
Among the Muslims, I'm a free Muslim in China, so although I'm a very secular Muslim, but
Sure.
I know a little about the scriptural language. Some people think that is a good way to understand the Quran and it makes sense, but others complain that it's not the good opportunity, it's not good way to express the pure
Right. Yeah.
thoughts. So I want to know what's your perspective. Do you think the scriptural language hinder the communication between the Chinese Muslim and the Muslims in the Middle East, or promote the communication between them?
That's a really great question. No one's asked me that before. I mean, for me, I don't think that the role of the scholar is to say this is a real or authentic way of interpreting Islam, and this is not. So I'm not going to answer your question directly. But for me, when I think of this, I think about, well, what does it mean to kind of to vernacularize a global tradition in a local context, and is what these figures and other, in the case of China, other scholars, are the various ways or methods of interpreting and making it sense in that social context, different than what would be happening in Egypt, for example, or in Saudi Arabia, for example, or Indonesia, or any number of places, or in America, right, using English as the vernacular language. So, I think this is a strategy that Muslims globally are using to make a tradition that has perhaps core sources meaningful within their own context. So, sometimes people talk about ideas about center and periphery, right, and that China is on the periphery of Islam, and usually when people kind of talk about that, they either implicitly or explicitly are suggesting that, right, they are far from the tradition, right, in the sense of inauthenticity, right, and I don't think that's true. I mean, I think right, Arab Muslims are the minority of Muslims in the world, so just because that is the kind of language of origination, right, the community of origination for the tradition, as scholars, are we going to privilege that as being more authentic or true or something like this than other interpretations? I don't think we should do that. I would suggest we don't do that, right? They're going through the same kind of local, vernacularizing processes in Arab and Arabic language contexts that are happening elsewhere. So, yeah. So I'm sorry, I'm not really answering your question, but those are the things that come up when I think of that, right? So, for them, it seemed to make sense, right? And as you noted, and I tried to kind of hedge my bets as I was going through here, saying, right, this is just one way of making sense of Islam in China, and of course, there's numerous other ways that you probably know a lot more than I do about.
Yeah, I just always heard a different voice among the Chinese Muslims. Some other people think the scriptural language is a very good way to help us to understand Islam and the Quran and something like that. But for young Muslims, they always complain about it. They think it combines the Persian and Arabic language, but sometimes it's not accurate to express the Islamic thoughts. So
Yeah.
they prefer to learn some Arabic language and Persian.
Yeah, sure. I mean, language is tricky, right? Translation is tricky, and there's never a one-to-one correlation that we can think of. So, yeah.
Well, why don't we stop here? But we'll thank Professor Petersen for
Yeah, thank you.